Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
For small businesses chasing federal contracts, the stakes are high, and the playing field isn't always level. Bid protests have become a vital check on the system, offering small firms a way to challenge unfair rewards and hold agencies accountable. But critics warn the process can be costly, slow, and ripe for abuse. As the federal government pushes for more equitable contracting, the question looms, is the protest system helping or hurting small business? Here with his insights is partner at Haynes Boone, Zach Prince. Zach, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
You testified recently before Congress on bid protest reform, and your testimony focused quite a bit on the potential impact to small businesses. So I want to dig into that with you this morning. Let's start with the basics. Why do you think small businesses file such a large share of the protests?
Part of it, I think, is that small businesses feel that there is a lot of challenge being taken seriously against some of the large established primes. Smaller businesses, fewer resources. Protests are a way to force agencies to take them seriously. Sometimes it's a way to force agencies to enforce the small business preferences also. So there is a good incentive there.
Well, we usually think about a bid protest as being a large prime against a large prime. And so how is the system supportive or not supportive of small businesses?
It can be tough for small businesses that don't have sophisticated counsel, which might account for some percentage of the small business protests. That is, you're disappointed you didn't get the contract, you don't have an attorney really on hand, and you just know about this protest thing, and you just go ahead and file a protest without maybe doing enough research into how it works. So there is definitely some percentage of protests, particularly at GAO, that are filed by businesses that are situated in that way. And those really do largely account for some of the frivolous ones that get thrown out.
But there's still a pretty good share of success, right?
Yeah, there is. So overall, protests are effective in 50% or more of the time. So what that means is that either GAO rules in favor of the protester or the agency takes corrective action.
So you mentioned frivolous protest. One of the proposals that's been talked about is a loser pays rule to discourage those. But for small business, that could be a big risk, right?
Yeah, it definitely can. And I think frivolous is a loaded term, and I probably shouldn't have used it. But the loser pays rule would be very challenging for small businesses, and I don't think it's necessary. So in a frivolous, whatever that we define that ultimately to mean, type protest, GAO is going to kick that quickly. That's not going to consume real resources. And then if you've got a protest that loses on the merits, it's very challenging to say that that's really, whether that was frivolous from the outset or not, or it was maybe just something that required probing the evidence and figuring out what was going on. The costs of protests are already really expensive. So to add on top of that, fees for the other side, especially where DOD and the government doesn't really know what their fees are or what their costs are, it gets challenging.
Would there be any kind of change that might actually reduce that kind of inapplicable challenge?
I'm not sure that we really need to, because we already are kicking them out pretty fast. GAO has proposed a enhanced pleading standard, and they did that because Congress told them they had to. But I'm not sure it really changes the rules very much. GAO has already had somewhat of an inconsistency in how they interpret their own rules. So this would clarify, perhaps, rather than just raise a new barrier for entry. So GAO is already doing a good job of kicking protests out when they have nothing. They're just reciting some of the basic things of unfair and disparate treatment and et cetera that we see in a lot of protests. So to get these types of baseless protests out, I think what we need to do is provide better information on the front end to contractors and disappointed offerers so that they know when the agency has really considered issues properly and thoroughly.
So you talked in your testimony about better debriefings and more transparency. Say a little bit more about that and specifically how that would support small business.
Sure. So it's been very effective. The enhanced debriefings have been the rule at the Department of Defense for close on a decade now. And I found them to be remarkably helpful in helping a protester, a potential protester, decide not to go forward. Is if they've gotten into the record, or their outside counsel has, depending on the level of detail that is being given, and they see that there's really nothing there. The agency spent over 100 pages thoroughly documenting its analysis and comparing it to the solicitation terms. They're not going to want to throw more money after a protest process, particularly because they can see the customer has invested time in it. And so even if they think they're right, the customer is going to be particularly annoyed.
I'm speaking with procurement attorney Zach Prince. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Well, you mentioned that DOD's gotten really good at the debriefing process. How are the rest of the federal agencies doing?
Not as good. And it's been an issue. And so one of the proposals that I made to Congress was they consider expanding the enhanced debriefing requirement to civilian agencies as well. It can be tough with civilian agencies when you get explanations for award that are paltry, is probably the nicest thing I can say about some of these. And we're talking about big contracts, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Companies spend a lot of time and money preparing proposals for these types of things. Now, set aside that for a small business, losing your $100 million incumbent contract might be fatal to the business. They need to understand what they did wrong and what they can do better.
One of the other topics that you talked about in your testimony was task order protests. Obviously, on a really big contract, small businesses may be part of the task order process as opposed to being a prime. How do task order protests play out, and why are they so important to small business?
So task order protests can only be brought currently at GAO. So what that effectively means is that there's no judicial review beyond the GAO decision. The government orders a lot of stuff through task orders and delivery orders, and a lot of small businesses are competing for these task and delivery order contracts. So you can't challenge to the Court of Federal Claims when GAO maybe got it wrong as a matter of law, or have a review from the Federal Circuit, which you would in any other type of protest. There's also a dollar value threshold. So you can't protest any DOD task or delivery order unless it's $35 million or greater. So that's a pretty arbitrary bar, in my view, particularly because the civilian agency bar is substantially lower. It would be better, again, in my view, from a matter of efficiency and justice, fairness, to have it the same way you do any other protest. It can be brought regardless of dollar value at the Court of Federal Claims or at GAO. There's often reasons to go to the Court of Federal Claims. Those protests are much rarer. And then at that point, you have a judicial review beyond that from the Federal Circuit. We've had all these disputes over the last couple of years of where the task order bar really ends. And that's just a huge waste of resources to argue about jurisdictional contours instead of getting down to the substance of the arguments.
You've been on both sides of the bid protest table, I know. If you were sitting with Congress now while they were drafting protest reforms, what would you push for?
I would urge them to be very careful. As far as I'm aware, having looked at the RAND report from 2018 and all the research that Congress has requested industry do, or directed industry to do, there's not a lot to say that incumbents are abusing the system, which is one of the quote-unquote fixes that's in the House version of the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. It doesn't seem like a real problem currently, so don't put something in that's going to be burdensome to implement, potentially harmful to small businesses when there maybe isn't a problem that we're aware of, other than people don't like these things, right? I get that. I don't like when I'm representing an awardee and the incumbent or anybody else says, no, you shouldn't have gotten it. But of course, on the other side of the table, I feel very differently. But it's an important mechanism for oversight of the system. And the data aren't showing abuses.
So if it's not broken, don't fix it?
That's a great summary.
Zach, thank you so much for sharing your insights here, and thank you for sharing them with Congress during your testimony. I've been speaking with procurement attorney Zach Prince. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.